talk is on gas attacks to drone strikes, the transformative power of new technologies in warfare. I would like to start by talking about an angel. And this is Paul Klee's painting of the Angelus Novus. It was owned by Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin wrote, and I will read this out at length because I think it frames my talk. A Klee painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something. He is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. He's often been called the liberal's angel. And war undoubtedly has brought measures of progress. It has been a locomotive of engines. The Twinkies has come out of the Vietnam War. Nylon was something that was sorry, I'm being interrupted. Would I like a headset? What to? Oh, that headset. Sorry. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Nylon was a product that came out of the Second World War. Tabasco sauce came out of the American Civil War. The Slinky was a Second World War, a Vietnam War invention. Tampax was used, came out of the First World War when nurses realized that the dressing they would mop up the soldier's blood also had another function. But really the angel sees harm. He doesn't see benefit. And so what harm does he see? Well, we've talked about some of the harms today. War is the bringer of atrocity. The technological advances that enables the creation of mines, the creation of cluster munitions, and ultimately the bringer of all death, the nuclear creation. I see within that the idea of technology somehow being the most impersonal of additions into war. We fear the killer robots. At the moment, this last week, the United Nations discussed the possible banning, as we've heard, of killer robots. Why is this? Because this idea of this supernatural force, the force of which we are powerless against, has resonance deep within our hearts. And I think the imposition of a very powerful technology in warfare causes a dramatic shift. And I see in the angel the outstretched arms. I see a powerlessness that you see throughout the 20th century in warfare. You see it in Guantanamo, the outstretched arms of those who are rendered entirely powerless. The outstretched arms in Vietnam. The outstretched arms of an Armenian genocide. And I see, and this is a motif, the form of the crucifixion as a very powerful illustration of humanity and inhumanity in war. Now, the crucified soldier is one of the most resonant images of the First World War. The idea that the Germans captured a Canadian soldier and crucified him up against a tree or a barn door. And this was reinterpreted. The French had a crucified soldier, the English had a crucified soldier, the Germans had a crucified soldier. Everyone had their own crucified soldier. And it became what is considered as black propaganda. But I wanted to know whether this propaganda that inspired memorials and inspired literature, inspired films after the war, could it have had a root? Well, I think to go back to that root, I went to the 22nd of April 1915. Now, the 22nd of April 1915 was not the first time that poisonous gas was used. Poisonous gas was used beforehand on the Eastern Front. But it was a time when there was huge levels of casualties. We don't actually have pictures really of it, but this is an illustration, although actually the people who were really affected were French Algerians, but I think by virtue of their race, they're not written into history. But the imposition of the introduction of gas into warfare, this terrible, unexpected bringer of death, had a tangible response. And I've read at length the letters of diaries of men who were present in the region. And one of the things that they did, the recipients, the Allies, the Canadians, the French who were on the receiving end or heard about it, they responded viscerally and personally to an impersonal attack. And what they did is they started massacring German soldiers. This is just one thing. We had enough to do to take care of ourselves and our own wounded to bother about prisoners. The execution of German soldiers that followed the first use of gas in the First World War was quite profound. And the German response to this, I believe, was that they responded in kind. If you execute our prisoners, we will execute yours. Gas brought intolerance, and intolerance brought an escalation of violence. You got into this siege mentality, this stalemate of violence begetting violence. Now, people thought maybe it was black propaganda, but I came across something that I believe the crucifixion did actually happen. This was a letter. I have reason to believe this was a letter written by the High Command. Written depositions testified to the fact that the discovery of the body are in possession of the British headquarters staff. I went to the Liddell collection in Leeds and I found a letter written by somebody called Nurse Challoner that identified a name of a man who she said was crucified. Sergeant Harry Band. The discovery of a name to a black propaganda is very, very rare. But if you found the name, I thought Harry Band was executed. Well, Harry Band, in Nurse Challoner's letters, claimed he was the one who was executed. I looked more at Harry Band, and sure enough, he's on the Menin Gate. He died on the 24th of April, and I found 3 other letters saying that he was the one who had been crucified. So could a crucifixion have occurred on the Western Front? I believe so. I believe it did. Of course, this crucifixion was transformed into black propaganda very quickly. The escalation of violence. Technology introduces intolerance, that introduces escalation of violence. The crucifixion of a Canadian, it became a cause célèbre. It became repeated and transformed over time. And it was added to by the fundamental fear that, strangely, if you were an executed prisoner, you were also put in a kind of a crucified position. So I think it resonated with the soldier's own fear as well. But the crucified soldier, this sort of resonance, and I believe that it goes back to this idea of the idea that the impersonal technological imposition in warfare causes very personal, visceral responses. We go back to rooted cases of violence that predates modern sensibilities. And this idea that the gas is emerging and people wearing these skins, the enemy begins to look surreal. The enemy begins to look as if they're from another world. And this idea of the evil enemy, you can read it in the press at the time, the idea that in the English press, the Germans didn't become human, they became inhuman. It became these shadowy figures emerging. And I think that ended up infecting one's own view of one's own inhumanity. And I think it's impossible to have a conversation about the first use of German gas on the 22nd of April 1915 in the Western Front without seeing the ugly premonitions of the Holocaust that was to come. I think there is a lineal connection, a cultural connection between the acceptability of using technology to kill people and the use of Zyklon B gas. Now let's fast forward into new technologies and the rapid use and the rapid utilization of drones, and such a technological thing. Men far away in the Texan deserts manipulating drones that hover over Pakistan. They actually recruit drone pilots from gaming competitions because they think they're going to be the most adept at being able to fly. So this very distance idea, this death from afar, it's become incredibly seductive. A quarter of all air combat sorties in Afghanistan are now drones. And the number of civilians being killed, this myth of the targeted drone attack, belies the fact that civilians are dying. And they're dying in numbers that are not in line with this idea of the targeted acceptability. And the spread of drone warfare around the world is continuing. At the moment, only Israel, UK, and USA. But the countries that are developing armed drones are France, Germany, Greece, India, Italy, Iran, Israel, North Korea, South Korea, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Taiwan, Tunisia, Turkey, UAE, UK, USA. The development of drones is across the board. And where they're occurring, of course, in places that aren't really developing them. The disenfranchised. Empower technology against those who have not the power to develop their own technology, who don't have those systems. Egypt, Gaza, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan. It's almost as if there's a war against the poor. And look at Yemen. Yemen, an incredibly impoverished country in many respects. A massive drone strikes. And the number of deaths, over time, far exceeding. And by 2012, we're looking at, over one drone strike every day. And you can see people with sandals on their feet, the disempowered, looking as if death has come from above, like Thor with his thunderbolt. How do you respond to that? How indeed do you respond to the impersonal attack? Well, you respond by personal anger, the burning of the flag. And most horrifically in 2012, this happened. The crucifixion, again. The belief that this man was a drone operator who was called through a strike. And this idea, I think this is the natural consequence of the imposition of putting new technological impacts into places where people feel disempowered. We can see the same thing happening in Pakistan. This idea, this conceit that civilians are somehow not killed by drones. 416 civilians have been killed by drones. Around 200 children have died at drone attacks in Pakistan. And 451 covert drone strikes by the US military. And the correlation between suicide bombings and drone strikes is very strong. Drone strikes causes a visceral response. And if we see suicide bombing in some way as being almost a self-sacrifice, a self-crucifixion, I think we should realize how this is going to be the response. And the use of suicide bombing in Pakistan has risen. There's been a 69% rise in civilian fatalities from suicide bombings in the last 3 years in the world. And it's become probably one of the most impactful weapons being used out there. The self-sacrifice, the bombing of the self. IEDs and suicide bombs now account for 71% of all casualties of explosive weapon uses in the world. So it's the asymmetrical warfare. We introduce in the West very high-tech, high-grade technological war. And the response of those who we're targeting is personal, visceral violence. And that violence takes the form of more and more crucifixions and personal human rights abuses. And I don't think we can see these crucifixions without putting it in the context of Western technological dominance. And so I would end saying that I believe the Angelus Novus, where the Angelus Novus sees progress, we should see the way in which that progress subverts and challenges and causes greater violence. And I'd like to end on Tacitus, and he says, we create a desert and we call it peace. And this is the fundamental danger, is we think that by imposing technological warfare, we will somehow make a quicker end to war. But I think what we end up doing is fueling the fires of intolerance and violence. Thank you.